And it looks like we are live. Give me just a second, guys, because as you already know, gotta let the stream breathe for just a few minutes as I get our Facebook groups in here and combine our wonderful Mile High Huddle community together on a wonderful Friday evening. Mile High hello, everybody in Broncos country. Welcome into another episode of the Dove Valley Deep Divers podcast. I am your host, Lance Sanderson. Joining me, as per usual, is my good friend and colleague. He is Mile High Huddle's senior NFL draft analyst, the one and only Erick Trickel. Erick, preseason, we got our next game, the final game of the preseason starting tomorrow against the Los Angeles Rams. Just got done with joint practices. Unfortunate injury news. We'll get to that here in just a few minutes. But football, man, we're back in the thick of it. We're back in the thick of it. A couple weeks now, we're going to have some actual live first team versus first team real football on our TV screens. How you doing, man?
Doing good. I'm excited for the regular season to get here already. I mean, it was nice getting preseason, but I'm already past the preseason football, of where, all the overreactions that we get constantly week in, week out, when it's guys going out there that most of them aren't going to be on teams this year. I mean, when you look at it on average, there's 21 players after the practice squad and the 53-man rosters that don't make anything with any team on average. So it's just, why are we overreacting to these guys? So I'm kind of done with that. I'm ready to get into the actual football, the first stringers going against first stringers, where it actually matters, where, the wins and losses actually matters, instead of just, going to hyperboles off of what fourth and fifth string guys who are going to be selling groceries this year are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm right there with you. You got insurance salesmen, cell phone kiosk attendants, kind of like Tatum Bell a long time ago with the Broncos. People that I'm not going to say don't belong on an NFL field, because if you've gotten this far in your career, you at least belong around everywhere, but maybe you don't deserve to be playing for the most part. And that's not a shot at anybody. These guys are out there living their dreams, and I never want to see anybody, miss out on that by any stretch of the imagination. But it's time for real football. It's always fun to do the evaluation process, going through the draft process, going through the off-season training camp and everything, learning a little bit more about football. But when it gets to the actual big boys, that's where things really get fun. And today, guys, got a great show for you. We're going to run down through the remaining roster battles of this Broncos roster, continuing on with this evaluation, getting our final evaluations going here on the tail end of the roster. Guys 1 through 40 are probably already figured out here. We've got 40 through 53 that we're going to try to break down, finalize these roster battles and everything. But before we get into that, guys, got to say hello to everybody here in the chat. We've got our good friend Albert Knoppers in the house. What's going on? Ernie Mays as well. Seth, William Catalano, Kevin Gray, Dylan Von Arks in the chat, running ones and twos and everything, just kind of moderating everything. Scott Kennedy is behind the scenes with us as well, helping produce the show. So we appreciate Scott for joining us here. David Yunkin, got a handful of people still kind of trickling in here as well. Thank you all again for joining us here on a wonderful Friday evening as we continue to break down this Denver Broncos football team. Now, Erick, let's just jump right directly into this thing. The quarterback position. We're going to go in roster order, guys, the way that the roster is listed, quarterback through offensive line, interior defensive line through the secondary, and break everything down here. The quarterback battle. There was an interesting conversation as camp opened up between Jarrett Stidham and Ben DiNucci, but you and I were talking a little bit earlier, dude. That competition was over about halfway through the second half last week against the San Francisco 49ers, because as Stidham was shaky, Ben DiNucci was terrible. Erick, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I thought at first you were going to say that when camp opened up, there was that conversation going on about if Jarrett Stidham can unseat Russell Wilson as a starter, because that was a talking point from a few people. I was never, one of those guys. For me, it was always, it's Russell Wilson's job barring injury. But yeah, I mean, the backup quarterback job, there was a right to question if Ben DiNucci can step up after the Arizona game, but it kind of fell flat. The 49ers game, while Jarrett Stidham wasn't outstanding, he was decent enough, and Ben DiNucci was essentially a disaster out there on the field. And from what I've gathered and everything, practice has been kind of following a similar sort of what we saw against the 49ers. Stidham has at least looked a little bit better than DiNucci, so no battle there. It's pretty much set in order. The only question is, do they keep 3 quarterbacks? And I think with the emergency quarterback rule that they will.
That was the next question I was actually going to ask you was, did Ben DiNucci do enough for you to I don't want to say cement, but at least put his name in pencil on this roster, because like you said, the new quarterback rules where you're able to keep 3. One of them you can keep you don't have to necessarily designate him as a game day inactive. You can still have him dressed and everything in case of emergency. Or do the Broncos go out to the trade market, maybe take a look around the NFL at cut down times? Obviously today we got the big news about a little over an hour ago, right about an hour ago, with the San Francisco 49ers trading Trey Lance to the Dallas Cowboys in exchange for a 2024 4th-round draft pick, which if it was me and I had the draft capital in Denver to do that, I would have absolutely pulled the trigger on that move. But regardless, that's in the past. We don't really have the opportunity to break that down. My question to you is DiNucci still at least enough to be able to stick around on this roster, or are they going to look in a different direction?
Well, I mean, if you can find somebody that's familiar with what Sean Payton does on offense, then yeah, you can look that way. But one thing that we see year after year when it comes to the quarterback position is teams like to stick with who they had at the position during camp on their roster and even on the practice squad. I mean, it's always a worry of, oh, will this player clear waivers? Turns out they do, because they don't want to pull that guy up onto the roster if they get claimed off waivers, or they just want to be kept in Denver where they were, because that's what the offense they've already gotten familiar with. So there's always that possibility, but I think that barring somebody, that is familiar with Sean Payton's scheme, it's probably going to be Ben DiNucci. But we do have a $20 donation coming in from David Cromlow saying, one, does Denver's bad performance in the joint practice convince you that they could be a sneaky contender for a top 2 draft pick? And then David is asking if I'm hearing anything about the Bears as a potential trade destination for Chris Jones. To answer your second question, no, I haven't really dug into anything about that. As for your first one, I have a hard time seeing the Broncos end up with the top 3 pick this year, even if they are actively trying, basically. Like, that's a bit of a hyperbole there. I think they can do enough on the run with the running game on offense and enough on defense to at least squeak out 5 or 6 wins. And that is barring Russell Wilson, returning to form and not looking like as good enough as he did during the preseason. That's taking that element out of it. Yeah. I think that may be a top 10 pick, but I think we're looking more likely, somewhere in the teens for the Broncos to land. What about you, Lance?
I'm right there with you on that one. And Dave, thank you for jumping in with us, and thank you for your donation. We definitely appreciate that, man. But this top 2 draft pick, top 3 draft pick, to me, that's not it. This defense is good enough to help you win a handful of games. It was good enough last year to win a handful of games. And while it's a new scheme, they're doing a lot of, I don't want to say different things. There's a lot of very similar things. But the biggest thing is they're going to create a lot more pressure, which is going to give a lot more turnover opportunities. And you've got guys out there, Justin Simmons, Pat Surtain, Damari Mathis, who got his hands on a lot of footballs at Pittsburgh. Even we're going to get to this conversation here in just a little bit, but Asang Bassi was out there creating turnovers in preseason games, had a couple of interceptions, in the first 2 games. Like they're going to create turnovers. They're going to create a lot of really advantageous opportunities for this defense. They're going to win 5 or 6 games alone based on just what the defense is able of doing, especially if Russell Wilson returns even halfway to his form of 2020. Like this is going to be a decent football team. And if Russell Wilson can carry it a little bit on the offensive side of the football, they have very good possibility to win 9 and 10 games this year. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's more of their ceiling. I think I put them at about 9 games. This year to win too. And it's like, one thing is with the whole preseason in general, and I know that David's question was about the practices, one thing that people often look is, they see the 2 losses and that's what they jump to. But when it was the players that are going to be out there during the regular season, first and second unit guys, Denver scored 16 points to 3. So 6-3 against the 49ers, 10-0 against the Cardinals. Like, I know you can't really just go off that, but we saw enough in those moments from those first unit guys that can make you comfortable going forward.
Just a big,
anyways, moving on to the running.
But I just want to piggyback off of that too, because it would have been 16-0 against the Cardinals in the first half. They missed 2 field goals in the first half. The first team offense got them into scoring position 3 out of 4 drives. They punted on the second drive, but they got into field goal position, missed the first field goal, punted, got into field goal position again, That one missed as well. And then they scored a touchdown. They were up 16-0 if you actually have quality kicking competition going on those first 3 drives. So 16 plus 6, 22-3 is what the first team offense is up going into the second half of the San Francisco 49ers game. So don't sleep on this team. I think that when they really start to scheme things up and Russell Wilson gets a little bit more comfortable, it's going to be a little bit different of a conversation.
Yeah. Now moving on to running back, fullback. Obviously, this is one of the big battles entering camp. Who's going to be running back 3? And what was the status of Javonte Williams? Well, Javonte Williams, miraculous recovery. He's going to be ready to go by the season start. Something that neither you or I, were expecting to see. Samaj P. Ryan, he's sitting there right behind him. And the number 3 spot, unfortunately, injuries did have their part to play in it, but it's Jaleel McLaughlin's job to lose at this point. It was Tyler Beatty. Tyler Beatty was very clearly the number 3 running back before he got hurt. He was the guy that when Javonte Williams wasn't practicing, Tyler Beatty was the number 2 guy behind Samaj P. Ryan. And it was very clear as well against the Cardinals. Tyler Beatty got in there with the second unit, and it wasn't until near the end of the game before McLaughlin and Jones got out there. So very clearly, and then Tyler Beatty got hurt. And then as for the fullback, it's Michael Burton's job. I mean, just what he does on special teams. And you saw the value that he can bring on offense against the 49ers with a couple of those short yardage runs that he had. To me, there's nothing really to shake it up. I think it's pretty much settled here. It would take, injuries, obviously, and I don't want to talk about injuries changing things up a whole lot, but injuries always can shake things up. For me, the question is, do they try to find a way to keep a 4th running back just in case? I personally don't think so because of roster math. I do have a 53-man prediction up. It's my final one where I only keep the 4 guys that I mentioned on it. And then the question is, who's going to be the practice squad running back? For me, it's pretty easy. It's going to be Tyler Beatty, just because Tony Jones Jr. has been disappointing in the preseason. He's had that one big run, but outside of that, it hasn't been, great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on that one. I want to kind of piggyback just a little bit off of what you were talking about there, because earlier this morning, actually, I believe it was right around noon, I published an article of the 4 guys with the most to lose going into this training camp game or this preseason game against the Los Angeles Rams tomorrow. And I have Tyler Beatty as that guy, because like Eric said, he comes in and Phil jumping in here with some stars. Want to just say hello. He's just not trying to jump ahead, but in case I missed the conversation, do you think Palczewski makes the 53? We're going to get to that here in just a minute, Phil. So just stick around and hang tight. We appreciate you for that. Michael Ronquillo as well jumping in here. Good evening, Lance and Eric on Dove Valley Deep Towers. Go Broncos and buck 'em. But back to Beatty. I mean, you said that you don't necessarily want to bring injuries into the conversation, but I think that was a big thing with Tyler Beatty. He showed that he was able to make some plays, at least in the first preseason game against the Arizona Cardinals. But then Jaleel McLaughlin came out and he showed day in and day out in camp that he belonged on this roster, and he did it in games. He had a really good game against the 49ers as well, but Tyler Beatty went down with that ankle injury, and he's been missing out on opportunities to showcase his skill set. So I'm not saying that it was the biggest reason why that he ended up losing out on his roster spot, but that definitely goes into the conversation here. My biggest question is, what does he look like? Go ahead.
Just to clarify, it was just a miscommunication on my end. I wasn't meaning that it wasn't a part of what Beatty is. I didn't want to get into injuries about making changes going forward.
Right.
What I was meaning is I don't want to be talking about injuries can shake things up with somebody getting hurt against the Rams. Not that it was injuries didn't play a part in getting McLaughlin onto this roster.
Oh, okay. So I apologize for that, but still, I think that the point stands here because with Beatty, he needs to have a big game against the 49ers. He's going to get a bulk of the carries there because, like we've said, McLaughlin is running back 3 on this roster. I think he's cemented his spot. And if Beatty can go out there and he can show that he can play well coming out of the backfield, if he can play well, showing that vision, showing the burst, the acceleration, maybe go out there and make a tackle on special teams if he gets an opportunity to do that. That's where the roster math gets really tricky because you said, Michael Burton is probably going to be the fullback on this roster. I don't disagree with that, but there's also an interesting conversation going on at tight end number 4 with Nate Atkins right now because he's been seeing some time coming out of the backfield as a fullback as well. Caught 3 out of 3 targets against the 49ers for 17 yards. He's shows that ability to kind of stretch the field vertically down the seam and everything. And he plays well on special teams. So that could be where this roster math gets really tricky is, are you going to keep that fourth tight end in Nate Adkins, or are you going to keep the fourth running back in Tyler Beatty? And Eric, I haven't got a chance to take a look at your 53-man roster projection. We'll get to that here in just a minute. But that's the big question to me is, can Beatty show enough to keep 4 running backs on this roster?
I mean, that's a good question for me. Is when you look at, I have the 4th tight end on my 53-man roster prediction. It's Nate Adkins. We'll get to that here in just a little bit. But when you look at special teams roles, what that 4th running back role is on special teams is completely different from that fullback or that full tight end one. Mm-hmm. And you can it's easier to make up for that 4th running back spot, but with a corner or a safety or a wide receiver than it is, especially in my prediction, with a couple places I went light on. So for me, I don't see making the roster math unless you're cutting out, I don't know, 4th tight end or a 5th safety or a 6th corner, unless you're cutting out something like that. I don't see a spot for a 4th running back and going super heavy with the offensive weapons. Now, moving on to wide receiver, Jerry Jeudy's injury is obviously, it sucks. Hopefully we don't see him miss a lot of time. Hamstring injuries are so tricky, though. Mm-hmm. I have a guy who works in the medical field in the NFL who he always jokes around. It's like, as soon as you see a hamstring injury, it's going to be 6+ weeks that they're out because they're so tricky and they're so easy to re-aggravate. And that is something for the last few years we have seen consistently from the Broncos. Somebody suffers a hamstring injury, they get listed as 4 to 8 weeks, 3 to 6 weeks, whatever. And 5-6 weeks later, we're finally getting them out there on the field on the higher end of that time frame because they're just so tricky. Mm-hmm. From what I've heard and seen about Jerry Jeudy is they're looking at him being back maybe week 2, but most likely week 3. He's even like a slim chance he's ready to go week 1. They're not betting on it though. So he's still going to make the roster. He's not a guy that I think they're going to bring over to the 53-man roster, then put on injury reserve and sideline him for an additional 4 weeks, unless it is more severe than what they've let on. And then outside of that, obviously you have Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, and I think Brandon Johnson, even though he's been dealing with the injury the last couple weeks, I think he's done enough to kind of cement himself on the roster. Mm-hmm. But you're still looking at who's wide receiver 5, who's wide receiver 6, and is wide receiver 6 going to be a return specialist? Is it going to be somebody who can contribute on offense a little bit? That roster math, I mean, it's such a big thing when you're getting down to it, and it can make some conversations pretty tough. And the wide receiver position is probably was the toughest one for me to figure out and put guys on my final prediction for.
Right. And it's also pretty interesting. And I heard kind of a conflicting report to what you were talking about with me the other day with KJ Hamler. KJ Hamler is returning from pericarditis. He has that heart condition that they're still trying to figure out his timetable of return. I know that they want him to stick around on this roster. They still have a role for him. But as of right now, like you said, you've got Cortland Sutton, you've got Jerry Jeudy, who's probably going to make this 53-man roster. I'm still intrigued to see if they put on injured reserve with a designation to return. That would make him miss the first 4 weeks at least of the season. So that's an interesting thing to just kind of keep your eyes on there. Marvin Mims, obviously the second round draft pick, he's going to make this roster for sure. You've got Brandon Johnson, who stepped in as the first receiver on the field after Tim Patrick went down with that torn Achilles a couple weeks ago. But then after that, you've got guys like Montrell Washington, you've got Kendall Hinton, you've got Taylor Grimes, a couple of Michael Bandy, a guy that was formerly with Joe Lombardi with the Los Angeles Chargers a couple of years ago. Those guys have all been really pushing themselves hard. And on top of that, you've got Marquez Callaway and Lil Jordan Humphrey, who have shown at least decently. My big question I'm going to bring to you here, Eric, is has the versatility and just the playmaking ability of a guy like Taylor Grimes, who he hasn't shown it much in games, but everybody out at practice is saying this dude is just uncoverable. He's so hard to be sticky on in coverage. And then you got Marquez Callaway, who has experience in the Sean Payton system. He profiles as that flanker receiver. Is that the competition we're really working on here? Like Kendall Hinton, Taylor Grimes, the versatility, inside, outside, stuff like that? Or is Marquez Callaway, with his experience, a guy that they're going to be putting on the end of this roster as that fifth wide receiver that just can be a solidifying presence for that room?
I think the edge for me goes to someone like Lil Jordan Humphrey or Marquez Callaway because of what they can do on special teams. Mm-hmm. Taylor Grimes, for all the hype that he got during practice, we haven't seen it in games. And part of that is because he's barely played in games. He's been one of the last receivers to take the field. He's only played 16 snaps on offense over the last 2 games. Part of me thinks is that they're just trying to not show him off a whole lot and try to help him sneak through waivers a little bit, because there's a lot of teams out there that need wide receiver help, especially, you know, for guys like 4, 5, 6. Just kind of try to help sneak him to the waiver wire a little bit so they can bring him back on the practice squad. And I think Kendall Hinton, I mean, it's tough because there's been a lot of positives coming out about him from practice, especially joint practices. But when you watch him against the 49ers, oh man, like it was just extremely frustrating for so many different reasons, because the holding penalties were terrible, but he's a guy who's supposed to be pretty reliable and trustworthy. And he wasn't even showing that. Even on plays where he wasn't being targeted, but still running a route, he wasn't getting separation. He was sticking with his guy. And there were multiple routes that I noted where he was just kind of like half-assing it through his routes. Like, is that the kind of guy that you really, you know, want to bring on as your 6th or 5th receiver, especially with the injury concerns you have at the position? I mean, it's tough. And I think that somebody mentioned it in the chat here. I think it was Albert Knoppers, about the receiving ability of Greg Dulcich. That also is going to play a factor into what they're doing with the receiver position as well. Part of me thinks that's why I think they'll only keep 5 receivers to start on the roster. And then maybe they'll go from there. Maybe things clear up a little bit. And then keeping that 6th receiver as a return specialist, somebody like Montrell Washington, because there's still things that he does that are frustrating in games, but he has cleaned up a lot of the issues that he had last year. He still has a long ways to go, but of the return guys that we've seen, particularly punt returning, he's been the best one out there. And he can still, you know, throw Jaleel McLaughlin out there on kick return, because he had that big kick return against the 49ers as well. So there's still options you can do with other people, but Montrell Washington, he just seems the most reliable punt returner to make it. If I remember correctly, I think on my prediction, I had Marquez Callaway and Washington being the final 2 receivers to make it.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense, especially with Callaway's ability as a special teams gunner. He's a quality special teams player, and like I said, he's got that familiarity with the Sean Payton system. Speaking of guys familiar with the Sean Payton system, this has been kind of floated around, especially after Jerry Jeudy just went down. Talking about the New Orleans Saints wide receiver depth chart right now. Obviously, you've got their standout rookie wide receiver from a couple years ago, Chris Olave, Michael Thomas as well. Rashid Shaheed is a player that they're expecting a whole lot of coming out of that flanker position, maybe even as a slot. But a guy that is familiar with Sean Payton as well, Traquan Smith, who has played that flanker position, the Z receiver. They do a really good job of motioning him around. He's a great deep threat. What is the likelihood that the Broncos could be interested in a player like that could come in and just offer a little bit more with the downfield versatility, and also as a blocker? He's a fantastic blocker in the running game. Is that something that the Broncos could potentially be interested in? Last question here on the wide receivers.
I mean, yeah, and I think that Traquan Smith is a guy who's going to be on the move, because when I was sitting there and digging in to the Saints and everything, they have a couple of rookies that have really been standing out through training camp in the preseason for them in A.T. Perry and Shaquan Davis. Both of them have been looking really good, and Shaquan Davis, he can kind of fill in a little bit of what Traquan Smith does. So can A.T. Perry. And they also have multiple receiving tight ends as well that they can sit there and use, you know, kind of not in that role, but use to help expand their passing game a lot. So I think he's a guy that could very well be on the move. And the Broncos obviously would make sense as to why they would be interested, because with the injury to Jerry Jeudy, you want somebody a little bit familiar with the offense, somebody who can sit there and come in and have an impact. And the familiarity is so important, because you're only going to have about 2 weeks to get the guy caught up. So the more familiar he is, the better. Doesn't cost a whole lot for the Broncos if they're to get him. He's still got a couple years left on his contract, because he's only entering year 3. No, he's on a second contract, if I remember right. If they extended him. So I don't think the whole cost is a whole lot there. And he's a guy that I've seen multiple Saints guys talk about as he could be a surprise cut even.
Yeah, absolutely. Quickly on the tight ends here, because we're running about half an hour right now, so we got to get through tight ends and the offensive line really fast. 4 tight ends or 5?
Good question. Actually, I think the bigger question is 3 tight ends or 4.
Right.
I don't think they can do 5 with the fullback. The question is, who's that 4th one going to be? Albert Okwuegbunam, he's kind of had a pretty strong week a little bit. I wrote about how, when I was talking about him, I said that he hasn't done great on special teams, never taken the regular season snap on special teams, has only taken 5 over the 2 preseason games. He had a few last year as well. I think he's like at 7 total, like counting regular season and preseason throughout his career. But he had 1 big block and was on that Jaleel McLaughlin big kick return. For me, though, I would rather take the consistency of Nate Atkins and the versatility he has. Albert Okwuegbunam is not much of a blocker, especially on offense. You're very limited in what you can do with him on offense. Nate Atkins, he's lined up everywhere. He's even lined up as a boundary receiver for the Broncos.
Yes, he has.
So it was only for a couple snaps. He has lined up everywhere for them and has done extremely well everywhere he has lined up. For me, it's pretty simple that they're going to be that Nate Atkins has the edge over Albert Okwuegbunam. And for me, with things that I've heard, with how things seem, it seems like the selling of Albert Okwuegbunam has started to try to get some team to come in and want to trade for him.
Right. And we talked about that last week and multiple times over the summer. I believe we talked about it even on draft night about how the Broncos had a team interested in trading for him. So that's always still a possibility. Those rumors have been swirling about Albert Okwuegbunam for almost a year now. It's been going on for a while here. So that's an interesting piece of information there, just to kind of chew on, put that in your back pocket and just hold on to that for a minute. And maybe you can say, we heard that here on Dove Valley Deep Divers first. But jumping back here to Phil's question, Phil McLaughlin, let's go to the offensive tackle position. I've got 2 questions here. First one, we're going to answer Phil's question here, saying, do you think that Alex Palczewski makes the 53-man roster, Eric?
So my 53-man roster prediction, and this led to actually a pretty heated, not really heated, but a pretty good conversation between you and I last week after the game when I was sitting there working on it as well, about keeping 4 tight ends. I really had to work the roster math to keep 4 offensive tackles on the roster, and part of it is I do think he makes it. I think he has very clearly been the best offensive tackle for the Broncos this preseason. He has worked his way up. He has just done everything right. He's gotten a lot of praise publicly. A lot of my guys that I've talked to, they've all absolutely raved about him and what he's been doing in practice. And offensive tackles, like after the Cardinals game, I did an article about if the Broncos struggle with their tackle position again against the 49ers, what can they do? So I was looking at every team around the NFL. Offensive tackle is extremely weak. Basically, no matter what team you look at. Very few of them do you look at and be like, yeah, that's a strong group. So offensive tackles, guys who show out in the preseason, if they get waived, they're probably going to get picked up on waivers. Alex Palczewski is a guy that I don't think you can afford to cut and hope to bring back on your practice squad because I don't think he clears waivers. I think he is good enough to have a team sit there and say, yeah, we'll pick you up. We'll keep 4 offensive tackles just to make sure you're there. And so I think the Broncos should do it and work their math around that. And we'll get to how I did it here in a little bit. But he, for me, has done enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you on that. When he's played left and right side, he was the first right tackle the second right tackle on the field against the 49ers, then left the field and then came back just to kind of solidify the forces down the stretch there. So and he plays well, dude. Like he moves well. He's quality in pass protection, good run blocker as well. Like he's a quality developmental right tackle. Absolutely.
He's allowed 1 pressure over like almost 60 or 70 snaps this preseason.
Yep.
And yeah, he did come off the field against the 49ers, but it was a situation that, I mean, we talked about it last week about getting Quinn Bailey out there at right tackle too. And that's what they did. They had Quinn Bailey at right guard, and Alex Palczewski at right tackle. Then they pulled Palczewski off, put Quinn Bailey there, and he did decently well there. And I can't remember. I think Will Sherman entered the game. And then they pulled Quinn Bailey, and Alex went back out there on the field as the right tackle and pretty much finished up the game there, and did well. So yeah, for me, it's pretty much cemented there with how weak the position is and the concerns that you have about the position in Denver. Garrett Bowles coming back from his leg injury and his consistency issues. Cameron Fleming struggling throughout the preseason. Mike McGlinchey missing the preseason, most of the camp with his injury. Keeping that fourth tackle there, yeah, you kind of got to do it.
Yeah. Well, and Polchesky played well enough on the left side. And I believe he got 10 or 15 snaps. It wasn't a whole lot on the left side from what I understand. Or am I thinking practice stuff? Because I know that he worked in practice.
Might have been in
the
practice, but he's only played right side exclusively in games.
Okay, so then I must be thinking about some practice stuff I heard about where they had him out on the left side and he actually looked pretty decent going against some first team guys. So like to me, that's a big thing and underrated aspect of this is the Garrett Bowles conversation moving forward. I mean, I doubt it happens this season, but the Broncos could very well easily move on from Garrett Bowles. They're going to
be his last season in Denver on his current contract.
Yep. Exactly, on his current contract, exactly. And if they cut him right now, I believe they save $11.8 million in salary cap space. So it's not out of the out of the possibility. There's a non-0% chance. Let me put it that way that Garrett Bowles gets cut. And Polchesky with the ability to play that left side, I think that's a big thing for him, being a developmental tackle. Speaking of Mike McGlinchey, though, this was the other question I had for you on the offensive line specifically. Sean Payton kind of left it open-ended on what starters could potentially play this week. We have not seen Mike McGlinchey at all this preseason. He had that knee sprain early. He's been practicing this week. Do you want to see Mike McGlinchey play against the Rams, at least for a little bit, or is that just let's put him on bubble wrap, get him healthy for the regular season, or do you want to see him out there on Saturday?
Put him in bubble wrap. We'll see him in the regular season.
Okay. I disagree with you a little bit on that. I think I want to see him just get out there a little bit in some live action. 1 or 2 series, not a whole lot of run. Just let him get out there and really crack some skulls more than what you do in these joint practices where you're not allowed to really go to the ground. I want to see McGlinchey get out there with some real contact. But like I said, only for
knee injuries. Knee injuries are so tricky. I would rather not try risk making it worse.
And that's
especially for a big dude.
I'm not going to disagree with that. Yeah. Oh, you're right on that. I think that might help him a little bit, get that confidence up and just show that, I still have the physicality. I still can go out there. Not really like the Javonte Williams situation, because I think that's a freak deal and you're never going to see something like that again, at least not for another decade, because it's been at least that long since we saw a return from that kind of an injury. With the knee sprain with Mike McGlinchey, I think that it would be wise to get him out there at least for a handful of reps, maybe even just the first series. Just let him get out there, crack some skulls, and just be done with it. That's my opinion. But
one point of order: it hasn't been a decade since we saw something like that with Javonte Williams. It's been a year.
What do you mean?
J.K. Dobbins.
Oh, well, J.K. Dobbins still hasn't come back to play. I mean, he kind of, but he hasn't been like that guy. I'm talking like the return to form.
He was back to start the season for the Ravens last year. And he ended up being sidelined again because he re-aggravated it. And yeah, the miraculous recovery aspect of it hasn't been, but we've seen it of rushing an injury back time and time again. I just rather not. But there was a comment here that I wanted to grab real quick. Let me see if I can't find it real quick. Sorry, I had it and then I updated. Keith Rugman coming in saying, what's the likelihood we cut below 53 to start? Scott came in and answered the question saying 0%, which is exactly right. They'll go to 53, and the only time they'll go below it is if they already have a guy, just haven't signed the contract yet, but they've already agreed to it. So they cut the guy and just wait till it's official that they've signed a guy. Mm-hmm. That's the only time and then also is when we talk about, specifically for me, when I talk about the 53-man roster, I'm not talking about the initial roster. I'm talking about what we're kind of looking at come the first week of the season, because over the first 48, 72 hours after the initial 53-man roster, you are going to see change after change after change. Mm-hmm. Guys who cleared waivers, veterans from other teams who are cut because somebody made a waiver claim off of somebody. It's just a constant cycle every year that takes 2 to 3 days before it really gets cleaned up. And I think the Broncos could be, if I can see the Broncos being one of those teams that is very active with churning the bottom of their depth chart on the 53-man roster.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of that bottom piece on the 53-man roster, this is the next big battle. I highlighted it on my 5 players with the most to gain against the Los Angeles Rams piece on Thursday. So make sure you guys go and check that out. But it's Kyle Fuller and Luke Wattenberg at center guard. That might be roster spot number 53, quite honestly, because who between those two is going to cement themselves as center number 2 and backup interior offensive lineman number 4? Because you're going to get you're going to get obviously Ben Powers, Lloyd Cushenberry, Quinn Miners. There's your starters. You're going to keep Quinn Bailey. That's offensive guard 3. We need offensive guard 4, backup center. like that interior swing guy that can play the center and guard position. And Fuller and Wattenberg are deeply entrenched in the battle right now. And quite honestly, it's a lot closer than everybody thinks. Eric, what do you think is going to be the fallout of this conversation following the Rams game on Saturday?
Well, I mean, if you look at Wattenberg and Fuller, I don't think that if they keep one of them, they have to keep a fourth guard because they both have had that opportunity to play guard. And for the most part, they've done well. I did like the fact that against the Cardinals, we saw Kyle Fuller at left guard and Wattenberg at center, and then they flipped against the 49ers. And it was a rough start for Wattenberg against the 49ers, but after the first series, he kind of stepped back up and started to hold his own at left guard. Kyle Fuller, to me, was a little bit worse at center than Wattenberg was, but he was better at guard. So it's a very interesting battle for me to figure out who's going to be it. It could go either way at this point. I'm very curious to see what they do, what the pecking order is come this Rams game, because this is the final shot. I could see Lloyd Cushenberry be one of the few starters who actually get some reps, because there are still plenty of issues with Lloyd Cushenberry. Don't get me wrong, he is looking a little bit better. He has a bad habit still of being late to get out in front of screens, especially against the 49ers. If you go back and watch multiple screens that when he was on the field, they got blown up because Lloyd Cushenberry failed or was late or lowered his head. Running plays, he does a lot better on combo blocks than he was doing last year, which is great to see in the running game. But he also has a bad habit of getting caught and not being able to get off and get to the second level in a timely manner. So I do think he'll play, but who's going to be that second center to come out on the field? I think that'll be pretty
good. Yeah, Scott comes in here with a beautiful comment in the private chat here. Just want to read this. He says, Lloyd Cushenberry arrives in time, just enough time to help the screen receiver off of the turf. That's absolutely correct, because he is so late. I believe it was the Javonte Williams screen. They threw a screen to Javonte Williams against the 49ers, and Cushenberry was so late. Javonte, I believe that was the one that he dropped. Cushenberry was so late to get there. He actually picked the football up off of the ground, if I remember correctly. It was such a bad play from Cushenberry. What play was it? He was so late.
It was the one that he shoved the defender into the running back.
Okay,
but the one that Javonte Williams dropped, I was going to say, is Lloyd Cushenberry's best two plays on screens have been drops. Against the Arizona Cardinals, a drop by Samaje Perine, and against the 49ers, it was dropped by Javonte Williams.
Gotcha. All right, let's flip over to the defensive side. Sorry, you caught me in the middle of a drink, and I don't know if you guys can see this on your guys' end. Just some inside baseball for everybody here listening to the show after the fact on the Huddle Podcast Network. And thank you all for joining us. But we'd love to see you live, but thank you for joining us after the fact. I'm dealing with flies. I've got flies attacking me from every single angle. It's horrible. But anyways, let's flip over to the defensive side of the football. Got about 25 minutes or so left here while we can kind of chop this up. Interior defensive line, I think that it's really kind of played itself out the right way. I highlighted a guy on my piece, the five with the most gain here the other day. Elijah Garcia potentially being able to sneak his way on as the interior defensive lineman number 5. Him and Matt Henningsen are battling that out. I think that Tyler Lancaster, who I highlighted with one of the most to lose, is a big deal going on there. And PJ Musser, that's kind of the conversation I want to talk about here, because we already know Mike Purcell passed his physical the other day. He's been removed from the non-football injury list, restructured his contract. Seems like that roster spot is locked up as his to be with the starting nose tackle. But those three guys, I think Garcia is probably the front runner for that sixth spot. If they do keep 6, maybe can even push Matt Henningsen for number 5. Eric, what do you make of this interior defensive line conversation? Because you and I have gone back and forth. I'm not super keen on the depth of this unit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super keen on the depth of this unit either, but getting Mike Purcell back is huge. There was some concerns that he wouldn't be ready by the start of the season. It was good that he passed his physical when he did. I mean, they couldn't wait any longer. I mean, if they had to wait longer on Mike Purcell to get back, the nose tackle is probably going to be Tyler Lancaster, who has been fine, but Mike Purcell is clearly better than he is. Jonathan Harris, when you talk about Matt Henningsen, it's worth noting that Jonathan Harris has already beat Matt Henningsen and pushed Matt Henningsen down to where now there is a battle of 5 or 6 defensive linemen. And if they only keep 5, who's that 5th one? Can it be Elijah Garcia, who is making the plays in the game, but is, from what I understand, not doing so hot in practice? Or is that Matt Henningsen, who he's been solid? I mean, a lot of people are going to point to that 2-point conversion where he got dragged into the end zone against the Arizona Cardinals, but he's been doing well, like in the preseason, minus that play. He just hasn't had those splash plays. But he's looked good in practice too. So how much of a factor is the splash plays in the game going to factor in for Garcia versus the consistency overall for Henningsen? We can see this play out against the Rams, and maybe Garcia does enough to where they work the roster math to keep 6 interior defensive linemen. I have a hard time seeing that again with my prediction. I only keep 5 just because of how the roster math turned out. So, and I think that getting Mike Purcell back, it's huge for what they can do with this line, because he's not the most versatile guy. He's purely a 0-1 technique. But DJ Jones, you can give him a little bit more freedom now. You can give Zach Allen a little bit more freedom. Jonathan Harris. You can give everybody else a little bit more freedom with Mike Purcell out there, which I think is huge, and helps them keep only 5 if that's the way they want to go.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. And having a guy that can really solidify that nose tackle role is such a big thing. And I don't want to spoil the article for everybody. Please go check it out, milehighhuddle.com. It just posted earlier today. Again, 4 guys with most to lose. And we talked about it. If Mike Purcell doesn't, pass his physical, restructure his contract, and come back on this roster, we're talking about Tyler Lancaster being the starting nose tackle for this team. And he does absolutely have the most to lose right now, because you're talking, like we said, he could have potentially been the starter. And now we're talking about him not even being able to make the practice squad, because watching the other interior defensive lineman, PJ Mustipher, who has ability as a nose tackle, he's better rushing the passer than Tyler Lancaster is, and he has a lot more upside. Which would you rather have? The more solid run defender, a guy that's just kind of okay, doesn't play with the greatest technical strength, doesn't play with the greatest technique as well, or a high upside guy like a PJ Mustipher who can get after the quarterback, move the pocket just a little bit? I think that Lancaster needs to have a big showing, even to just make the practice squad, when we were talking about him potentially even being the starter on this roster. Big time thing for his conversation against the Rams this week.
Who would you rather see as a potential replacement for Mike Purcell next year? Tyler Lancaster or PJ Mustipher?
PJ Mustipher, because he has the ability to get after the quarterback. And that's exactly what it is.
That's your practice squad guy right there. And it's also worth noting that you can only keep 6 veterans on the practice squad now. So are you going to waste one of those 6 spots? I mean, 6 is a good amount, don't get me wrong. But are you going to use one of those 6 spots on a guy like Tyler Lancaster?
Probably
For me,
not.
it was always with Tyler Lancaster is he makes the roster or he's somewhere else. I don't think he was really a practice squad guy for multiple reasons. Part of it being PJ Mustipher. I mean, he's had a pretty good preseason. Still a lot of technical issues there that he needs to work on, and got to work on his balance too a little bit. But those are things that you want to work with on the practice squad. Tyler Lancaster is he is what he is kind of guy at this point in his career. So I'd rather go with PJ Mustipher. For me, as I said, it was always the roster or somewhere else for Lancaster.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving back a level on the defense, we've got the off-ball linebacker, stack linebackers, inside linebackers, if you will, just to appease Scott here for just a second. I'm kidding, buddy. It's good. But I don't think there's really a conversation here. Obviously, you got Josie Jewell, Alex Singleton, Drew Sanders. Justin Strnad is probably the 4th guy on that list. I don't think that anybody else on the roster has really made a case to be that 4th linebacker there. So, Eric, do you have anything there, or we just kind of move back to the secondary?
I mean, Justin Strnad is clearly ahead, but the one rookie, Ajiaki, I can't remember how you say his last name. Dude flies. Flies around on the field, flies around on special teams, gets him out of position a lot, which I think is why Justin Strnad is the favorite here. But one thing that I think we could see here, the scouring of the waiver wire, scouring of cuts, because linebackers are like running backs. There are, when you're looking at filling out the bottom of the depth chart, there are plenty of options that can be that 4th guy that will get cut. Now, will they end up being starter quality? Probably not. Like, there's a big difference there. Just as there's a few elite backs, there's few good, great elite linebackers as well. So I could see them scouring waivers. I could see them looking into a potential trade for somebody. There's multiple things I could see them doing at it, because Justin Strnad, he's looked solid, but he still hasn't looked, like I'd be comfortable enough if something happens to Josie Jewell or Alex Singleton for him to step up or both of them actually, because he's the fourth guy, to see him out there on the field.
Right. I think that he's looked a lot more comfortable moving away from the football this season, Justin Strnad, that is, rather than having him fly sideline to sideline. Him moving backwards has actually been kind of a breath of fresh air, I think, for him. And he's actually looked pretty decent. Took a while for him to first off, he bulked up, it looks like, as well. He added a little bit of weight to his frame, but he looks more comfortable moving backwards. And I think that's a big sign for his development. I'm with you, though. I think that you could still move on and upgrade from him, but at least for now, without really scouring through the cuts and the free agency wire and stuff like that, it's hard to really project anybody else to be on this roster. Obviously, you can't predict the future, but at the same time, like, and Strnad, you could get better than Strnad, but he has improved significantly from the last time we saw him a couple of years ago.
And I got to say, you skipped a position when we got to linebackers.
Well, edges. Yeah, the edge.
So Rodney Garcia coming in, perfect, segue here. Evening, Lance, Eric, and Scott in Broncos country. What do you guys think of Christopher Allen so far? Does he make the roster? Thank you, Rodney, for your question. And to answer the second part of it, no, I don't think Christopher Allen makes the roster. I have a hard issue with this edge room here because I don't see a reason to keep a fifth edge in this group if you're going to be getting Baron Browning back after week 4 or 5 off the PUP list. Obviously, if somebody gets hurt, then obviously you can bring somebody up. But which of the other 4 edge rushers has done enough to earn a roster spot? Mm-hmm. No one. Aaron Patrick's the closest, just because we've seen his ability on special teams during the regular season. But Thomas Nkoum has been completely missing during the regular season. He's dealt with double teams upon double teams and chips upon chips throughout the 2 games so far, but the few one-on-ones he's had, he hasn't really taken advantage of it outside of holding up against the run. Marcus Haynes had a couple of decent pass rushes against the Cardinals, barely played against the 49ers, and I guess he's been struggling quite a bit in practice as well. Christopher Allen, I mean, he was a complete disaster against the Cardinals. He had a couple good rushes against the 49ers, but was a disaster outside of that. None of those 4 have done anything to be that 5th edge rusher on this team. I'd rather save the spot, keep 4 edges, bet on Gregory Clark being able to stay healthy, and keep that 4th tight end or that 4th offensive tackle, or that just keeping somebody else that can actually contribute in a decent way on offense if needed. Now, of course, you're looking at this far down the depth chart. Not even sure if they're going to be one of the game day actives, but if they are, again, I would rather go with the guy who at least has something to offer on offense or defense besides just some solid, decent special teams play. Lance, you're muted.
Can you hear me now? My microphone became unplugged, so I'm probably not going to sound the greatest. I do apologize for that, guys. Little technical difficulties. But GLP jumping in here with the $5 super chat, saying, hi, Lance, Eric, Dylan, and Scott. Go Broncos and Buckham. Thank you, GLP, for that. We appreciate that, guys. Again, I just completely lost my train of thought. Do apologize.
So Peter comes in asking how many extra draft picks get cut. I think multiple can end up getting cut. Obviously, nobody of the Sean Payton era. Depending on what happens at center, we can be looking at Luke Wattenberg. We can be looking at a lot of guys from last year being cut. Obviously, Nick Benito is safe. Greg Dulcich is safe. Damari Mathis is safe. But, the later guys, Wattenberg, Washington, they're on the bubble. Guys before that, there's a lot of guys up there on the bubble as well. Justin Strnad being one of them. But yeah, the edge room, I mean, if they can stay healthy, there's plenty of potential in the room. But just outside the top 4, they just don't have anybody. And again, it is a position that I would rather wait and see what they get out of, the top 4 guys, Gregory Clark, Cooper, and Benito, while they wait for Browning. Then force a 5th edge on there. And you can replace that special teams role with a guy like Adkins from the tight end position. Moving to cornerback, for me, it's pretty much cemented up or set up or shaped up. Patrick Surtain, obviously, Damari Mathis has cemented himself as the backup corner. Quan Williams is obviously the backup slot corner. McMillan, he's been the primary backup boundary corner. So I think that's safe, even if Riley Moss gets back and healthy. From what I gathered, McMillan was working his way above Moss even before that injury happened. And then somebody comes in and asking about if Forsyth and Skinner are safe. I thought so, but lots of MHH guys saying they don't think so. Alex Forsyth, I just don't see how you keep him with the numbers game on the offensive line. He's clearly offensive center 4. He's behind Fuller. He's behind Wattenberg, and he hasn't been getting shots at guard in games. And then Skinner, we'll get to that a little bit when we get to the safety position. So my only question at cornerback is if somebody can surpass Bossy as the backup nickel, and I'm just not sure. Looking at the other corner options, I'm not sure who it can be. Faion Hicks has been decent, but not great. Tremont Smith, I mean, his contract, yeah. If you cut him at this point, you come out even. You just 1.8 million salary, 1.8 million salary cap hit, 1.8 million dead. You just could break out even there. Having to pushing a little bit to next year, but he's been absolutely terrible out there, and he hasn't been great on special teams, which is what he was brought in to help with. Fabian Moreau has been decent, but probably more of a practice squad guy. I don't think any of them can unseat Bassi because I think the luck that he has had has just been good enough to help him. And I guess he's been looking a lot better in practice than in games. And just with the versatility that you have with some of the guys at the boundary corner, you can do that. As for safety, Simmons, Stearns, Jackson, and Locke, they're all set. Do they keep a 5th guy? And if they do keep a 5th guy, is it Delaire and Turner-Yell or is it JL Skinner? JL Skinner, to me, when I have been watching him over the preseason, he can hit, but he still has issues identifying his run fields. He has issues identifying his positioning and coverage. It has been a lot of issues that is very clearly that seeing his uncomfortableness in coverage, seeing his adapting to the NFL game, and not being so much of a box safety, kind of like he was at Boise State for most of his career. Delaire and Turner-Yell, he's looked a lot better on special teams than he did a year ago. And he was a good special teams player for the Broncos last year as well, despite the unit being so terrible. And then on defense, he's looked good. Has it been great? No. He's been good enough, though. As the 5th guy, you're looking at special teams here as the biggest thing for it. And I think that Delaire Turner-Yell is ahead of JL Skinner for it. And then the final one is what's going to happen at kicker? Punter's obviously safe. What's going to happen at long snapper? There's been rumblings that they can still, look out there, be looking for a long snapper. And then for kicker, they have apparently been in contact with a couple free agent kickers still, and they have been eyeing a potential kicker from the New Orleans Saints, who they are determining if they want to cut the veteran Will Lutz or go with the younger guy that they have. And Denver has been linked with a possible trade for the kicker there.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Am I back and all good to go? I apologize for the technical difficulties, guys. My microphone cable all of a sudden just quit registering on my computer. So I do apologize for that. You ran through a lot of it. I was able to hear a bunch of what you just said. I want to piggyback a little bit off of the kicker conversation. Obviously, Will Lutz is a guy with the experience with Sean Payton. Struggled last year. Only made 74% of his kicks last year, which was one of the worst of his career. And unfortunately, that's worse than what the Broncos had in Brandon McManus last season. So that's an interesting conversation. There's another one that I want to have here quickly, though, because I believe it was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers just moved on from Rodrigo Blankenship. Was one of the better kickers in college football for the Georgia Bulldogs for a handful of seasons. In fact, one of the greatest kickers in college football history. So would you be interested in the Broncos bringing him in at least for a kicker tryout?
You mean Chad?
I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to say it. But
I'll say it. Rodrigo
Blankenship
looks like Chad.
He looks like Chad. He looks
especially
like
with the helmet
Chad. It's
on.
awesome. Yes,
but
yes, he does.
No, I wouldn't. I think as good as he was in college, it hasn't translated into it. There is a reason why he is bouncing around the NFL. I mean, he was there in Indianapolis for a couple years, and then I think since then he's been with 5 different teams or something like that. There's a reason why he's bouncing around. There's been issues of making it in practice and everything. So just not a guy that I would look at bringing in.
Yeah, and that's a fair assessment of the situation. It was partially because he looks like Chad, and just honestly a recognizable name. I don't think that they're going to go out and get a guy. Mason Crosby's pretty well washed up. Robbie Gould is decent. He can still kick it, but he hasn't made anything over 55 yards in like 5 years. So there's a conversation to be had there as well. But yes, this is so Scott pulled it up. Scott pulled up the picture. If you guys are watching this live, you got to check this out. This is Rodrigo Blankenship. He was drafted, I believe, by the Indianapolis Colts. This is him in a Colts uniform. He looks a lot like our own Papa Bear, Chad Jensen. So got to give a shout out to Chad as well. And he's a good sport about it. We joke about it with him all the time. Look at this beautiful SOB right here, man. I can just hear him. Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up podcast, or however Chad does his intro anymore. You can almost hear him through the TV screen. So shout out to Chad. We miss you here on DVDD, man. It'd be nice to have you join us for one of these shows and just chop it up and enjoy some football. I want to go back to the edge conversation, if I may, just for a few minutes. And a big question that I have is Baron Browning. Obviously, you talked about him just a little bit with him coming back. If they do keep Aaron Patrick for that special teams versatility, which you were talking about, and then they do need a person to move on from. Obviously, Patrick's going to be that guy. But what have you heard about Baron Browning and what he looks like, what he could potentially, like the role that he could have for this defense? Because he was really growing there. He's become a big fan favorite for his versatility. And from what we saw with him a couple of years ago, before the knee injury, before the shoulder injury, and then he had arthroscopic knee surgery, he was growing into a player that could be a dynamic edge defender. What do you think his role is going to be when he comes back to this roster?
He'll be an edge.
No. Okay.
And just to be clear with that, he's on the PUP list. They'll probably, when it comes down to the roster cuts, they'll probably just put him on the PUP, keep him on the PUP list, which means he has to miss at least the first 4 weeks of the regular season before they can think about activating him. And then they have a period where he doesn't count against the roster until they actually fully activate
2 weeks.
Him. Yeah. So that's just kind of what the process will be with Baron Browning. But yeah, it's a guy that his versatility is great, but it seems like they really want to settle him down, working as an edge. I mean, they can still drop him into coverage as an edge, something that we're going to probably see a little bit more often from Vance Joseph than we saw from Evero. We've already seen quite a bit of it from this defense during the preseason, and it'll probably carry over a little bit, along with more, trying to disguise things a little bit. And I think Baron Browning can do well with that. My question is when Baron Browning is where is he at in the pecking order with how much growth we have seen from Jonathan Cooper and Nick Bonito?
Right. That was more of the question I was trying to get to you was what's the pecking order there? Because quite honestly, I think there's a conversation to have right now on who's going to be the starter opposite of Randy Gregory on this roster. Whether it's going to be Frank Clark or whether it's going to be, I think that Jonathan Cooper has a shot here. I really do. He has surprised me in his ability to get after the quarterback. He's surprised me with growing against the run. He's pairing moves together more and more every time he's out there on the field. And what we saw, and I don't know. I want to take Sean Payton's word for what it was. They had a target number of snaps. They wanted to get everybody out there. But Jonathan Cooper started that game against the San Francisco 49ers last week. Frank Clark played into the fourth quarter, well into the fourth quarter.
So did Gregory.
Signed. Yeah, exactly. Bonito and Cooper were the first two. Well, I guess Gregory started. Bonito played the majority of the first half, though. Gregory and Frank Clark played the majority of the second half, and Frank Clark didn't see the field, I believe, until the second quarter. I think that's a sign. I really do. Like I said, let's take Sean Payton for what it was. He had a snap number that he wanted to get everybody to, and Frank Clark had to play the last quarter of the game just to get to that snap number. I think Jonathan Cooper has a really good shot at winning the starting edge defender position opposite of Randy Gregory this year. I really, really do.
Frank Clark got out there on the second drive.
Okay.
And then even in the fourth quarter, when they were still putting Gregory and Clark out there, Bonito and Cooper were still seeing snaps as well.
Okay.
Like they were just rotating him a little bit. Biggest thing with Frank Clark is they're just trying to get his legs loose after missing so much time with injury. I doubt he'll play a whole lot tomorrow.
Okay.
With the way his contract is, if he's not the starter, we'll probably start hearing about some issues there because it's going to hurt his ability to get some of those bonuses for extra money. And it could reflect badly on the Broncos in the back end of things a little bit and with agents and stuff like that. Now, I think that edge for me with this group isn't super big on who's a starter and who isn't. There's going to be a big rotation here. you're going to see a lot of guys getting in that, that 50-60% mark for total snaps consistently for it. Just not a lot of guys seeing that 80 plus snap percentage out of this because they're going to be just rotating them so much.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. I remember that was a big issue, I guess, was something that I wanted to bring up with Frank Clark, was the fact that he was playing late into that game. And they kind of asked him in the locker room, it's like, what did you feel about playing late into this preseason game in the fourth quarter? And he's like, I don't really have a feeling. Ask the coaches about it, was kind of the way that it was put to me. So that I may be looking into that a little bit more than you should, but at the same time, you've got a 10-year plus veteran in the NFL that played a lot of snaps in the fourth quarter of a preseason game, that has been a tried, tested, and proven player at the NFL level for a long time. So with that, though, guys, I think we pretty much covered it. I'm not going to jump into the safety cornerback conversation. We are running out of time here, just at our hour mark. Eric did a really good job of breaking all of that down behind the scenes. I'm still having some issues with my microphone, so we're going to have to cut it short here on a wonderful Friday. Thank you all for joining us here on a great episode of the Dove Valley Deep Divers podcast. You guys can follow us on Twitter by finding me at LanceS_MHH, and for Eric at Erick Trickel. Notice the CK in Eric and the EL in Trickel. Also, guys, while you're at it, big shout out to our guy Scott Kennedy behind the scenes, running the ones and twos, helping produce the show. Get to him at Scout Kennedy. Also for Dylan, I believe his is Arks Von D on Twitter as well. So shout out to Dylan Von Arks behind the scenes as well. Also, guys, while you're at it, please make sure you guys are following at Mile High Huddle. That's the mother account where you guys find breaking news and analysis, opinion articles, film breakdowns, anything regarding the Denver Broncos. You're going to find it there at Mile High Huddle and also at milehighhuddle.com. MHHmerch.com, guys. That's the merch booth where you guys can find yourself a hat, a t-shirt, face mask, coffee cup, anything to support the website, anything to support the podcast. We definitely appreciate all of that. And if you guys aren't financially able to do so, the three things at the bottom of your screen, which we always love to shout out to everybody, because it's the easiest way you guys can support the show with 100% certainty. Subscribe wherever you guys are watching this, listening to it after the fact, whether it's on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you guys get your podcast content. Please subscribe to Mile High Huddle. Like every video you guys see across every social media platform, including all the articles as well. And if you love it, please share it, guys. Get it in front of as many Broncos fans as humanly possible, all your friends and family, because without your guys' support, we couldn't do what we do best, which is cover the Denver Broncos. Now, Eric, one last thing before we get out of here. Starters. How many starters do you think should play? Do you want to see anybody specifically out there? I know you mentioned Lloyd Cushenberry. Maybe on the defensive side of the football, anything else you want to see from starters against this Rams team? And with that, I'll let you take it away for your last words.
Yeah, I think very few starters should be playing. I mean, and it's a big conversation that's going on right now after they cut down to 3. It's because that third game was always the dress rehearsal for the regular season. Yeah. And they'd set week 4, and we're seeing teams that they're still trying to figure out what they want to do with it. Some teams, they still treat it as a dress rehearsal. Other teams use it like it was the normal 4th game. Unsure which way. I think I lean towards using it kind of like as the old 4th game, playing very few starters, just guys who still could use a little bit extra reps. I start, the four offensive linemen, the 4 starters there, except for McGlinchey, of course. And really outside of that, maybe Mathis, maybe Stearns, but not a whole lot.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I'd like to see a little bit more out of Jonathan Harris, just to kind of solidify that start. See some more out of him as a starting interior defensive lineman, that third guy out there, and see if he can really stave off Matt Henningsen for this last little bit. We're not going to see Purcell with him being cleared. That's another player I'd like to see a little bit, but probably not going to happen. I think McGlinchey should play a little bit, not much. We already talked about that a little bit. I really want to see Brandon Johnson, though, the wide receiver. Him coming off of that ankle injury, I think that's a big one. Projected to be wide receiver 3 at least, more than likely wide receiver 2 now with Jerry Jeudy going down. So I want to see what he looks like coming off that ankle injury and kind of translating what he was able to do in practices into a game experience. Let him get it, the first quarter, maybe the first quarter and a half or so, couple series out there, throwing the ball a couple times and see what he looks like. But outside of that, I'm really looking forward to seeing Tyler Beatty, Tyler Lancaster, see if he can hold on to that last spot. And then Alberto Cuebanam. I think that this is a big shot for him to maybe not only crack that final roster, but at least, if nothing else, really kind of drum up some trade interest from teams across the rest of the NFL. With that, though, guys, you all stay safe and take care. Have a great weekend. As always, go Broncos. We will see you guys same time, same place next week. By the way, programming note, I'm going to be linking up with Thomas Hall tomorrow night on Orange and Blue View. So make sure you guys check that out tomorrow night, 6 o'clock before the game. So anyways, guys, we'll see you guys same time, same place next week.